Power and authority, kings and queens of Europe. Let's set the stage for what's happening in Europe in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The nations in Europe are going to experience a prolonged period of conflict. Several things are contributing to this. Remember that the Renaissance has changed man's view of himself and his place in the universe and put a lot more focus and emphasis on the individual, and people are beginning to question authority. The Reformation had created religious divisions and conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, and exploration was opening new lands with rich supplies of resources and encouraging competition among the nations. So all of those factors are working together to cause these periods of conflict. How did the governments respond? Number one, they wanted to increase wealth and power to be able to compete with and defeat their rival nations. Number two, they wanted to strengthen the king or the monarch at the expense of the nobles and the common people so that the king could maintain control. When a ruler has total control, that's called absolutism, and that's really the type of period that we're looking at here. Thirdly, they wanted to limit criticism from their opponents as much as possible to demonstrate their authority. This is also a period of time where kings believed in the divine right, or that their power to rule came from God. Some other important factors. The nations were enduring economic crises. Imports of gold and silver from the areas being explored caused inflation or rising prices, while shortages of land and food developed. Population growth strained resources, and plague and famine outbreaks were common. Also, over about a 100-year period, more than 100,000 people were charged with witchcraft. Suspects were often tortured until they were confessed or were executed. Women were more likely to be accused than men, and poor landless people were more likely to be accused than the wealthy. So this sort of shows the contrast between old traditional ways of thinking and new ways of thinking. Okay, let's look at France in the 1500s. They had a period called the Wars of Religion, which were the Catholics versus the Huguenots. The kings of France and the ultra-Catholics raised armies to persecute the Protestants. The Huguenots were Protestants who'd been heavily influenced by Calvinism, and this included about 40 to 50% of the nobles. Henry of Navarre became king, and he was a Huguenot. He's King Henry IV. But he converted to Catholicism because he understood France would never recognize a Huguenot as king. And then he issued the Edict of Nantes, which recognized Catholicism as the official religion of France, but granted religious and political rights to the Huguenots. So in this way, Henry IV is able to kind of bring this period of religious conflict in France to an end. If you fast forward to the 1600s, then we're talking about one of France's most famous rulers, Louis XIV, known as the Sun King. Prior to his coming to power, a series of ministers had kind of worked to protect the king's power and eliminate opposition. Louis XIV wanted to be the sole ruler of France. He established the palace at Versailles as a way to centralize power. He could bring all the people who worked for him there and keep an eye on what they were doing. He gave himself absolute authority over foreign policy, taxes, and religion. He bribed local officials to do as he pleased in areas that he couldn't directly supervise. He persecuted the Huguenots until many fled the country. He followed a system of mercantilism with his colonies so that he could build up the economy and the military, and he imposed tariffs on imports and built a network of roads and canals to make it easier to move goods within France. He waged war to gain territory, but when he died, France was left in deep debt and in a period of turmoil. So this is the situation in France in the 15 and 1600s. In Spain, the most powerful ruler of the time period in the 1500s is King Philip II. he wanted to consolidate the lands that he'd inherited from his father. And so he takes the military and goes into areas of Spain and the Netherlands as well as the colonies of the Americas to make sure that he can keep them under Spanish control. He's strictly Catholic and wants to defend the Catholic faith both from the Muslims and from Protestant heresy. He raised an armada or fleet of warships to invade England and crush the Protestants there, but he was unable to defeat the English navy, and in fact many of his ships were lost in a storm as they tried to sail back home to Spain. At his death, it seemed like Spain was the most powerful nation in the world, with the largest colonial empire, but in truth the treasury was bankrupt, the armed forces were out of date, and the government was inefficient. In England in the 1500s, Elizabeth I of the House of Tudor was the ruler. She became the leader of Protestant nations of Europe and built a world empire. She solved religious issues that she inherited from her half-sister, Queen Mary, who was Catholic. She enacted the Act of Supremacy, which named the Queen the only supreme governor of both church and state. And the Church of England was Protestant but moderate, and that satisfied most of the people in the church. She was also moderate in foreign policy and tried to balance France and Spain against each other, but she made sure that England had military superiority. The English had the fastest, most nimble or easy to maneuver ships, and they had more long-range guns than their enemies. Therefore, the Spanish Armada was unable to defeat the English navy. So Elizabeth I governs over a period of relative calm in England. But when you come up into the 1600s in England, you see that the same sort of pattern of turmoil is in place there. James I and Charles I were both sympathetic to Catholics in England. They believed in the divine right of kings and tried to limit the Parliament's authority. Ultimately, this results in a civil war. The Cavaliers are the supporters of the king versus the Roundheads are the supporters of Parliament. Parliament won the Civil War, led by Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell then emptied the Parliament of anybody who opposed his policies and had Charles I executed in 1649. He abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords and set up a commonwealth and wound up dismissing Parliament entirely and ruled by himself until his death in 1648. At that time, Charles II came to power and restored Parliament as well as the monarchy and gave limited rights to the Catholics and Puritans. He continued to be sympathetic to the Catholics, and James II is even more devoted to the Catholics than Charles, so it seems like you're going down that same road again. At that point, Parliament intervened, and they invited the Dutch King William of Orange and his wife Mary, who was James' daughter by his first wife, to invade England. And this is called the Glorious Revolution because we get a change in government with no bloodshed. James II, his wife and son fled to France. A Bill of Rights was passed in 1689, and the Bill of Rights gave Parliament the right to make laws and levy taxes. It also gave them control over the army. It gave citizens the right to bear arms to protect themselves against the king's army and to have a jury trial. The Toleration Act of 1689 gave Puritans but not Catholics freedom of worship, and the divine right of kings theory in England was destroyed, and instead they were governed by a constitutional monarchy, or a government that had limits. In Germany and Central Europe in this time period, there was fighting between the Austrian Habsburgs and the Protestant Calvinist nobles. Most of that fighting occurred on German soil and destroyed German towns and lands. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the fighting, but it also ended any sort of German unity, as each state in Germany, and at times there were almost 300, was allowed to determine its own religion and conduct its own foreign policy. Coming out of this period, the two most powerful German states were Prussia and Austria. Power was consolidated in Prussia under a king named Frederick I, but Austria was more ruled by groups or coalitions of local leaders in the Habsburg Empire. Finally, let's look at what's happening in Russia in this time period. Ivan IV, who's also known as Ivan the Terrible, was the first Tsar, and he expanded Russia's territories and crushed any opposition that he had. And he's succeeded by Peter the Great, who was also an absolute monarch who claimed the divine right to rule. Peter is interesting because he visited the West and decided that he wanted to make Russia more like the countries of Western Europe. And so he reorganized the army and navy to give himself the power he needed to do that. He divided Russia into provinces to create a well-ordered community, but what happens is it creates a sense of fear among the residents that they're always being watched. He wanted to teach the Russian people Western manners of dress and culture and ways of behavior, and he went to war with Sweden so that he could get access to a port on the Baltic Sea, and he built a city there which he named St. Petersburg after himself, which served as the Russian capital. Thanks for listening. If you need to rewind or rewatch any part of this video, please do so now.